If you are using a stored procedure for data transformation via task object or creating common administrative utilities for repetitive tasks, it's important to know how to handle exceptions. This ensures that your stored procedures can deal with unexpected situations smoothly and gracefully if error occurs. This chapter, chapter 18, is all about exceptional handling in stored procedures or anonymous block when writing them using Snowflake SQL scripting. Here, you will learn how an exception is raised by Snowflake engine while the SQL script are running within the stored procedure, different type of exceptions and error codes, difference between statement error versus expression error, how to catch exception and handle them, how to define custom exceptions, how to handle chain of exceptions, how can we create multiple exception block to design a robust stored procedures, and finally, what are the implicit or so-called built-in variable like SQL code, SQL error message, and SQL state, and how to capture the exception message in an audit table for analysis and debugging purpose. The focus of this video will not be limited to just SQL syntax. This is a completely hands-on tutorial and we will understand the overall exception handling design approach while working with Snowflake SQL scripting. So, if you want to master the exception handling in Snowflake, stay tuned until the end of this video. We have already covered many important concepts in this playlist. If you haven't seen these chapters yet, please watch it after completing this video. The links for all the videos are available in the description section below. Alternatively, you can also visit my Medium blog page to find all the sample SQL script which are going to be used in this tutorial. As a part of this tutorial, we will cover all the points listed here in this tree map. Pause the video, review them before you proceed. So let's jump to our Snowsite web UI and see all of them in action. And please remember to hit the like button if you have been benefiting from my content and if it is contributing values to your Snowflake learning journey. Welcome to my channel Data Engineering Simplified. For all my demonstration and SQL scripting execution, I will be utilizing the free trial edition of Snowflake on AWS Cloud. All my tutorials are recorded in 4K resolution. So please adjust it if you are playing this tutorial in the low resolution like 720p or 1080p. If you want to learn quickly, you can change the playback speed of this tutorial, and for that consider watching it at 1.25x or 1.5x speed. To share your feedback directly to me, feel free to message me on my Instagram account or join my exclusive Facebook group to be part of the Snowflake community. And finally, if you are interested in systematically enhancing your Snowflake skill, check out my premium Udemy courses. Just scan the QR code and access my Udemy page. This is my first worksheet called Exception Handling in my Snowsite web UI. And this is the database and schema which I have selected for this worksheet. And this is the role system admin which I'm using throughout my demonstration. So let's start with this anonymous block. And this anonymous block is going to drop a table named table does not exist. And once it is dropped, then it will return a message drop table statement executed. Before we drop this table, let's see what all table exist in our public schema. I have only one table called employee, and this table does not exist. So what happens when I try to execute this anonymous block? This anonymous block ends with an error saying that 002003 uncaught exception of type statement error on line number 2, position 4, SQL compilation error. Table does not exist or not authorized. So when Snowflake SQL engine is trying to execute this set of anonymous block, this statement fails and this statement raises an error. After the error or exception has been raised, no further statement can be executed beyond this line. Now what if I wrap this entire anonymous block as a part of stored procedures, and let's create this stored proc and try to see the behavior. So my stored procedure got executed because during the creation of the stored procedure, this statement is not executed. So Snowflake SQL engine doesn't know whether this table exists or not, because it is possible that you might create the table after creating the stored procedures. But now if I try to call the stored procedure, let's see what happens. It ended with the same exception, and it says it is a statement error. Now let's go and quickly check our query profile and see how does it look like. So if you look into these two lines, this is the line where I'm calling the stored procedure, which is failed, and then this particular statement also got failed. Now if I go inside this, here it says uncaught exception of type statement error. And if I go to this statement and it says SQL compilation error, table does not exist or not authorized. So now you can understand how this statement recorded a different error message and this stored procedure recorded a different error message. Now if I go to this anonymous block, which is start with begin and end with end keyword, and here I have a drop table statement followed by return statement. Let's go inside this. Here, this also says uncaught exception of type statement error, line number 2. So whenever an exception is raised during the execution of your stored procedure or anonymous block, this is how the query profile record those error messages. So throughout this demo, we are primarily focused on anonymous block, and you can always use that anonymous block within the stored procedure and try to simulate the exception behavior. Now, I would like to show one more important thing about the query history. And this query history view belongs to account usage schema, and this account usage schema belongs to Snowflake database, and this Snowflake database is a shared database which can only be accessed with account admin profile. So let me quickly switch to the account admin role. And now let's see all the queries which is having execution status equals to fail. So if you look into this query history view, it captures all the query which is executed, and this is my username which has executed this failed query. And if you look into this query type, which is unknown and select, and if I look into this select query, here this is my begin drop public table does not exist. So this is another alternative way. If you cannot fetch the query from query activity screen, you can always come back to this particular table and fetch the detail and identify which all queries got failed. And this is the error message uncaught exception statement error, and it also captures error code. Now let's talk about another scenario where I have simply altered my drop statement to a select statement, and let's see what kind of exception is raised by Snowflake engine. For select statement also, it says statement error, and there is either object does not exist or not authorized. Now this is my third anonymous block where I am defining a local variable called total employee and of data type number, and this is running a SQL statement which says select count from employee, and then finally it is returning the total employee count. Let's first execute and see the result. I got total 10 record as a part of this anonymous block execution. Now I am making a minor changes and I am dividing this employee count with 0 and creating an expression here. Now let's execute this anonymous block, and in a standard programming language, if you try to perform an operation like this, it says divided by 0 is not possible and it stops the execution. Let's see what Snowflake does for this anonymous block. So if you look into this outcome, it says expression error on line number 2, position 33, division by 0. So return statement is not executed because this Snowflake scripting statement raised an error, and right after the error, the Snowflake engine does not execute any statement after the exception has been raised. So now let's understand how to catch an exception so our anonymous block can gracefully end. So this is my new anonymous block, and if you look into this section, this is my declared section where I am defining a variable called total employee with a default value 0, and on the line number 12 trying to fetch the employee count, and I have intentionally given that divided by 0. So this particular line will raise an exception during execution, and after that I am returning the total employee value, because if this statement gets executed properly, obviously the return will also be successful. And then if any exception is raised during the execution of this 1 or 2 line, then this exception block will try to catch anything which is raised from this block. Now let's understand how this exception section looks like. So it starts with a keyword called exception, and then you can specify when keyword, after that type of exception which it has to catch, and then what action it has to perform, right? So it will return -1 if it is an expression error. If it is a statement error, then it will return -2, and if the error is neither expression nor a statement, then it will come to this final block, and here all other exception, if it is not met as a part of these two blocks, then it will return the total employee. And we know this line will fail, and this will try to come to this expression error, and it will return -1. Otherwise, it will return the total employee, which is a default value of 0. Now let's execute and see the behavior. So first, I will remove this divided by 0 and execute this anonymous block. So I got my result 10, looks good. Now what if I make it 0, and let's change this value to number, and let's execute it. So here it got -1, and this -1 is coming from this statement. So if you notice, this line number raised an error or exception, and it directly jumped from here to here, and this is the block which handles all the exception which is raised in this body, and it matches expression error, and that's why it ended here. Now what if I change to employee1, which doesn't exist, and remove this divided by 0, and let's remove this part also. So this time this is -2. So since this object doesn't exist, it is an statement error, and in that case it landed here, and this handler returned -2 to the caller. So this is a simplest way of handling the error, and those errors are raised by Snowflake SQL engine during the execution. These are the built-in error or exception which are raised during the execution. Now, is it possible to simplify this two line by combining both of them in a single line? Yes, you can do that. And for that, you have to use a keyword called OR. And let's move this. And then let's remove this part. Okay, so let's execute it. Now, if you see, the anonymous block raises an exception of type expression error or statement error. You can combine both of them using an OR keyword, and that way you can simplify your overall coding approach. So now you have an obvious question. Once this exception block is executed, Snowflake does not execute anything after that. Let's try to understand what we are talking about. Now this is my another anonymous block, and in this block what we are doing, we are actually running a drop statement, and this drop statement is trying to drop a table which doesn't exist. Now this drop statement will certainly raise an exception, and that exception would be caught in this exception section, where if it is expression error or statement error, it will just run a select 1000 SQL statement. If it is other than these two error, then it will come to this block and will run a select 2000 statement. Now once this exception is handled, the code will come down to this line, and it will create a result set where it will run select star from the employee table, and it will return the result set. Now let me just change this to that. Now let's execute this and observe the behavior. So my anonymous block has returned null record. However, it has really executed this block successfully, and exception has been handled. Now let's go back and check in the query activity screen. How does it look like? So this is my anonymous block execution, which has executed successfully, and my drop table got failed. And after the drop table, my select 1000 dummy query executed. So this has been recorded properly, and this is running as expected. However, we did not see this statement. It means after the exception is raised to this block, Snowflake only executed this part and all other part is ignored. But what if I have to make sure that this statement is also having its own exception block, and this statement is having exception block? How can I achieve that? In a complex stored procedure logic, you would not prefer to end your stored procedure in an inconsistent state and simply come out of the execution. To achieve that, let's first try what happens if I try to copy this exception block once again right after the let keyword. So if I give this to 3000 and to this 4000, and let's try to run this anonymous block. So it ended with a syntax error because in any begin and end block you cannot have two exception keyword. So to achieve this goal, what we have to do, we have to wrap this set of statement in another begin and end block. Now if you look into this new approach, this is my main begin and this is my first begin and end block, where I'm trying to logically perform this drop operation. If something goes wrong, this exception will catch it. Then I have second begin and end block, where I'm trying to fetch all the record from the employee table and checking and finally returning the result set. Now, if I have a lot of complex execution, which I have to treat them as a atomic unit, in that case, I have to wrap them with begin and end, and that way I would be able to have multiple exception section within this begin and end blocks. Now let's run this anonymous block. So I haven't got the result. So as we have learned, nothing is executed after the exception. So I have to move this return to this line. I will change this version to 4 and let me re-execute it. Now I got the result which is expected, and let's go back to the query profile. So this is my version 4, and if I look into this particular query, this is my version 4. This is my begin block and this is my second begin block, and this is the return statement. Looks good. So this is the drop which failed and this is the status. Looks good. And right after this fail, this section 1000 got executed, which is a part of exception handling block, and then it executed select star from the employee table, and finally we got the result as a part of a statement, even though we have one query failure. So if you have a multiple subsections within your stored procedures, make sure that you wrap them within begin and end block, and within that you can have exception section, and that is how you can design your exception handling within your complex Snowflake stored procedures. In the previous section, we have seen that we have this implicit exceptions which is raised during the execution. But what about this other, and when can we reach to this other section? So in Snowflake SQL scripting, you can create a custom exception. If you look into the line number 6, here this is my custom exception, and this is the name of this exception variable. This is the type of this variable, which is of type exception, which takes two arguments. The first argument is a number and second argument is the error message. And once you declare your exception, you need to raise the exception, and here I am just using a keyword called raise, and after the raise keyword you can give the name of the exception which you want to throw, and then the exception handler will try to catch this exception by matching this when criteria, and accordingly it will return the statement. So we know this return statement will never be executed, because even before that Snowflake will raise this exception and it will simply come to this section. And if you see other exception, so this custom exception is raised and thrown from here, and when it reaches to this line, it try to matches whether the raised exception is matching with expression error or statement error. If no, it will go to this block and finally return this statement. Is it possible to create an exception variable without providing this input parameter? Yes, it can be done. So if I remove this, let's try to see what happens. So yeah, it is possible, but in that case, you don't have to give any open bracket and close bracket. What if I specify a positive value called 1? Let's see what happens. It ends with an error saying that the error code must be between minus 20,999 to minus 20,000, because all other numbers are reserved for Snowflake implicit errors. Now, I can also change this to, so if I know what exception is being thrown from here, I can specifically have a when clause, and this when clause will catch the custom exception and it will end the overall block gracefully. Let me execute it. So now my custom exception block got executed instead of other exception, and that is how you can declare different custom exception as per your project requirement or a logic requirement, and you can raise them as and when necessary. So for example, if you're expecting a table should have n number of rows, you can declare a custom exception and check that condition. If that condition is met, you can raise the exception, and from that exception you can perform a certain type of a logic to continue your transformation rule or your utility rule. In the next part of this video, we are going to talk about implicit object which is provided by Snowflake when it comes to this exception block. So I extended the previous anonymous block with some additional implicit object, and these implicit objects are called SQL code, SQL error message, and SQL state. Let me explain. So whenever your flow reaches to the exception block, Snowflake create three distinct built-in objects, and those objects hold your SQL code, SQL error message, which is nothing but this error message, and the state of SQL. So the SQL code is primarily 5-digit signed integer. The SQL error message, which is primarily defined by user, and SQL state is also 5-character code coming from your ANSI standard SQL state. So before I execute this piece of code, let me create this audit table. And I have only one field called message of data type text, and let's select this audit table. I do not have any data. Now after I execute this anonymous block which is handling the exception, let's see what happens. So obviously it is not returning because it ended with an error, and if I have to see what error it captured, then I can run this select star from audit table. And here it says SQL code is -20001. SQL error message is custom error message, which is matching with this error message. And this is your SQL code, which is P0001. And if you look into that, after this audit message, which is created dynamically, an insert statement is executed to insert the audit message. This is the way you can capture your SQL code, SQL error message, and SQL state, and ensure that while running your complex transformation via stored procedure, you log each of this state, and these implicit objects are available when you have the exception section. Now let's try to see if I try to move this audit statement here. So what I have done, after exception, the when keyword should come. I just added this variable assignment here, and let's see what happens. So it ends with an syntax error. So this line is not expected, so I have to remove that. So this is how you can use the exception section in your stored procedures, create a custom exception and raise the custom exception as per your logic, and you can use this implicit object to capture the exception code, exception error message, SQL state, and register them in an audit table. And in the future, we will see how Snowflake supports the event table, which can also allow you to capture your error message logging at different level. I hope you got something valuable from this video. If you did, please hit the like button. Your support not only recognizes the work behind this free content, but also helps others to discover this playlist. And if you think it can help someone else in your team, feel free to share. Thanks for watching, and let's spread the knowledge and growth together.